He was the man who turned bureaucracy into a machine of mass murder. He wore round spectacles and kept meticulous records. He raised chickens on a farm in Bavaria and wrote affectionate letters to his daughter. And yet, Heinrich Himmler stands as perhaps the single most consequential architect of genocide in all of human history. A mild-mannered administrator who constructed the infrastructure of hell and ran it with the efficiency of a corporation. What exactly were the crimes of Heinrich Himmler? How did a former poultry farmer from Munich become the overseer of the most systematic program of mass murder the world has ever seen? And what was the true scope of the atrocities carried out under his direct authority? In this video, we are going to find out. So, without further ado, let us start at the very beginning. Heinrich Leutpold Himmler was born on October 7, 1900, in Munich, Bavaria, the second of three sons of a devoutly Catholic schoolteacher named Gebhard Himmler. His father had once served as a tutor to Prince Heinrich of Bavaria, and it was that royal connection that gave the new baby his first name. The family was solidly middle class, respectable, intensely pious, and deeply nationalistic in the way that much of Wilhelmina Germany was nationalistic, proud of the new German Empire, proud of its military traditions, and convinced that Germany had a special destiny among the nations of Europe. Young Heinrich was a sickly child, plagued by respiratory complaints and stomach ailments that would follow him throughout his life. He was not athletic, not physically imposing, and not popular with his peers. He was, however, studious, diligent, and possessed of a powerful need for order, for systems, for hierarchy. He kept detailed diaries from an early age. He catalogued everything. He made lists. These habits would prove enormously consequential. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Himmler was 13 years old and consumed with a desperate desire to serve. He watched his older brother Gebhard go off to fight and burned with envy. By 1917, his father's connections helped secure him a cadet position, but the war ended in November 1918 before Heinrich ever saw combat. That failure to participate in the great national struggle gnawed at him for years. He felt cheated of his chance at proving himself, and like so many young German men of his generation, he channeled that frustration into the poisonous political movements that sprang up in the chaos of post-war Germany. He joined the nationalist paramilitary Freikorps, those irregular right-wing units that fought communists and foreigners in the borderlands of the collapsing German Empire. He studied agronomy at the Munich Technical University, dreaming of becoming a farmer, and he nursed an obsessive interest in German medieval history, in Teutonic Knights, in ancient Germanic mythology, and in the emerging pseudoscience of racial theory that was proliferating through the radical nationalist press. It was in Munich in the early 1920s that Himmler first encountered the Nazi Party, and more importantly, first encountered Adolf Hitler. He attended a Hitler speech in 1922 and was transfixed. Here, he believed, was the leader Germany needed. He joined the Nazi Party in August 1923 and participated in the Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923, the failed coup attempt in which Hitler tried to seize power in Bavaria, marching through Munich carrying a flag alongside a group of armed conspirators before the venture collapsed in a hail of police gunfire. Hitler went to prison. Himmler retreated to the farm. But he did not give up. He threw himself into party organizing work, traveling Bavaria on his motorcycle, giving speeches, recruiting members, building networks. He was a tireless, methodical, and utterly devoted functionary. He was not charismatic, he was not inspiring, but he was relentlessly, systematically effective, and that mattered more. In January 1929, Adolf Hitler appointed Heinrich Himmler as Reichsführer SS, the leader of the Schutzstaffel, the SS. At the time, the SS numbered fewer than 300 men. It had been created in 1925 as a personal bodyguard unit for Hitler, subordinate to the much larger and more chaotic SA, Ernst Röhm's brown-shirted stormtroopers. It was considered a minor posting. What Himmler did with it was extraordinary. Within 4 years, he had transformed the SS from a 300-man ceremonial guard into an elite organization numbering over 50,000 members governed by a strict racial selection criteria, an internal code of absolute loyalty, and a quasi-religious ideology that Himmler himself largely designed. Every SS man had to prove his Aryan ancestry back to 1750. Every SS man had to meet physical standards that Himmler personally imposed, though Himmler himself, with his weak chin, round spectacles, and receding hairline, would never have passed them. The SS was Himmler's creation, his life's work and his primary instrument of power, and through it he would eventually control virtually every coercive mechanism of the Third Reich. The crucial turning point came in April 1934, when Himmler, with Hermann Göring's support and Hitler's blessing, took control of the Gestapo, the secret state police, in Prussia. This was a pivotal moment in the history of the Third Reich. The Gestapo had been created by Göring in 1933 as the secret political police of the largest German state. Now it passed into Himmler's hands, and Himmler understood exactly what it meant. Combined with his SS and his control of the political police in Bavaria and most other German states, it gave him command of an interconnected empire of surveillance, terror and enforcement that answered only to him and to Hitler. He appointed Reinhard Heydrich, his brilliant, ruthless and deeply sinister deputy, to run the Gestapo in practical terms, and together they began building the most comprehensive political police apparatus in German history. Then came June 30th, 1934, the night of the Long Knives. Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, had become an embarrassment and a threat. He spoke of a second revolution. His millions of brown-shirted followers made the conservative military establishment nervous. Hitler ordered his elimination. It was the SS, Himmler's organization, that carried out the killings. SA leaders across Germany were arrested, dragged from their beds, shot in improvised prisons. Röhm himself was murdered in his cell at Stadelheim prison. In total, somewhere between 85 and 200 people were killed in a single weekend of organized murder, and Hitler presented it to the German public as the crushing of a treasonous conspiracy. The SS emerged from the Night of the Long Knives as an independent formation directly subordinate to Hitler and no longer answerable to any other organization. Himmler's power had taken a quantum leap. He had proven that the SS would kill on command, and he had established his organization as the premier instrument of state terror in the Nazi regime. Over the following years, Himmler expanded his empire with extraordinary ambition and considerable cunning. In June 1936, Hitler appointed him chief of the German police, unifying all German police forces under his authority and merging them with the SS into a single apparatus that combined political surveillance, criminal investigation, and ideological enforcement into one seamless machine. The ordinary German policeman now answered to the same chain of command as the SS officer. The distinction between law enforcement and political terror was deliberately and systematically erased. Himmler created the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, specifically to staff the concentration camps. He created the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence service of the SS, which he placed under Heydrich and which became responsible for monitoring ideological deviations among the German population, tracking enemies of the state, and gathering intelligence both domestically and abroad. He created the Waffen-SS, the armed SS, which would eventually grow into a military force of nearly 1 million men fighting on every front of the war. He was building an empire within the Third Reich, and the Third Reich itself was his instrument. What made Himmler's crimes so utterly distinctive, so historically unprecedented in their scale and organization, was the industrial nature of the murder he oversaw. He did not commit crimes of passion. He did not engage in the improvised violence of the pogrom or the massacre. He built institutions. He created bureaucracies. He established procedures and chains of command. He allocated resources and drew up budgets and wrote memoranda. And those institutions systematically murdered millions of human beings. Let us examine each major category of crime with the attention to detail that it demands. The concentration camp system was among Himmler's earliest and most enduring criminal creations. The first concentration camp at Dachau near Munich was established in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler took power, and it was Himmler who established it, announced it at a press conference, and placed it under SS administration. He personally designed the management structure of the camp system, creating the position of commandant, and establishing the internal regulations that would govern all camps. From this beginning, the system expanded enormously. By 1939, the main camps included Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, and Ravensbrück. Tens of thousands of people had passed through these facilities, primarily political prisoners, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others the regime deemed asocial or dangerous. The conditions in the pre-war camps were brutally harsh. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor, systematic beatings, starvation rations, medical neglect, and torture. Hundreds died every year from mistreatment. But this was, in the terrible arithmetic of what was to come, a relatively contained horror. What happened to the camp system after 1941 would represent something entirely different: the transformation of a network of prisons into a machinery of systematic extermination. The path to the Holocaust was not a straight line, but Himmler was present and complicit at every stage. The persecution of Jews in Germany began with the legal exclusions of 1933, accelerated with the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, and culminated in the organized nationwide pogrom of November 9th and 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, Himmler's SS and Gestapo arrested approximately 30,000 Jewish men across Germany and Austria and transported them to concentration camps at Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. This was the largest single mass arrest in German history to that point. The men held in these camps were beaten, humiliated, worked to exhaustion, and in many cases, murdered. Most were eventually released on the condition that they agreed to emigrate and surrender their property. This mass arrest was organized by Himmler and Heydrich and executed by the SS and Gestapo. It marked a qualitative shift in the persecution of Jews in Germany, moving from legal exclusion and economic spoliation to mass incarceration and physical violence. And it was Himmler who made it happen. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 brought the first truly mass atrocities under Himmler's authority. He had prepared carefully. In the weeks before the invasion, he established the Einsatzgruppen, mobile task forces composed of SS and police units, tasked with following the advancing German army into Poland and conducting what was euphemistically described as security operations. In practice, these operations involved the systematic murder of Polish intellectuals, clergy, teachers, aristocrats, politicians, and anyone else identified as belonging to the Polish leadership class. The Nazis called this the intelligence action, and it was a deliberate attempt to destroy the cultural and intellectual leadership of the Polish nation in order to reduce the Polish people to a leaderless mass of slave laborers. Between September 1939 and the spring of 1940, the Einsatzgruppen and associated SS and police units murdered somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Polish citizens in a campaign of systematic mass execution. Entire towns saw their prominent citizens dragged out and shot. Priests were murdered in their churches, professors were killed in their homes. Himmler oversaw these operations, received regular reports, and approved the methodology. These murders were carried out in his name and on his orders. But even these crimes, enormous as they were, represented only the beginning of what Himmler would authorize and organize. The great turning point came with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in human history, and it was from the beginning conceived as a war of racial annihilation, not merely a military campaign. Hitler and Himmler had agreed that the war in the East would be conducted along entirely different lines from the war in the West. There would be no observance of the laws of war with regard to Soviet prisoners. There would be no respect for the civilian population. The war would be a war of extermination against what the Nazis described as Judeo-Bolshevism, and the SS and police apparatus that Himmler commanded would be the primary instrument for carrying out the ideological dimension of the campaign. Before the invasion began, Himmler created 4 new Einsatzgruppen, lettered A through D, and assigned each one to operate behind a different German army group. These were not small units. Together they numbered several thousand men, including SS officers, Gestapo personnel, members of the Ordnungspolizei regular order police, and in some areas auxiliary units recruited from the local populations of occupied territories. Their mission, communicated to them by Heydrich before the invasion, was the murder of Jews, Communist Party officials, and anyone else deemed a threat to the German occupation. The Einsatzgruppen were equipped, funded, and commanded by Himmler's SS and police apparatus. The murders they committed were documented in meticulous Ereignismeldungen, event reports, which were circulated to hundreds of senior Nazi officials, including Himmler himself. He knew exactly what was happening. He had ordered it to happen. The scale of the killing that followed was almost incomprehensible. In the first weeks and months after the invasion, the Einsatzgruppen moved through the cities, towns and villages of the newly occupied Soviet territories and murdered Jews by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands, then by the hundreds of thousands. They would enter a town, round up the Jewish population on the pretext of registration or resettlement, march them to the outskirts of the town or to a nearby forest or ravine, order them to undress and surrender their valuables, and then shoot them into mass graves. The murders were carried out with extraordinary thoroughness and extraordinary cruelty. Infants were shot alongside their mothers. The elderly were shot in their homes if they could not walk. Children who escaped were hunted down. The killings were not secret. German soldiers watched and sometimes participated, and local populations often witnessed what was happening. The most notorious single massacre of the Einsatzgruppen period occurred at Bavaria, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev in Ukraine. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, Einsatzgruppe C, working with units of the Order Police and Ukrainian auxiliary forces, assembled the Jewish population of Kiev after ordering them to report for resettlement with their documents and valuables. Over those 2 days, 33,771 Jewish men, women and children were marched to the ravine, ordered to undress and shot. It was the largest single massacre of the Holocaust. The Einsatzgruppen report documenting the massacre was filed, numbered, and distributed through the SS bureaucratic system to Berlin, where Himmler's office received it. This was systematic murder organized at the institutional level. Himmler visited the killing sites. On August 15, 1941, he witnessed a mass shooting at Minsk and reportedly nearly fainted at the sight of the blood and brains of victims splashing onto his coat. But he did not order the killings to stop. He gave a speech to the SS men carrying out the massacre, telling them that he understood the terrible burden they were bearing and that history would recognize their sacrifice. He then asked his doctor to develop methods of mass killing that would be less psychologically distressing for the perpetrators. The result would be the gas vans and, ultimately, the death camps. By the autumn of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered approximately 500,000 people in the Soviet territories. But the Nazi leadership was reaching the conclusion that shooting alone could not accomplish what they intended. The occupied Soviet territories contained millions of Jews. Poland contained millions more. Throughout German-occupied Europe, from France to Greece, from Norway to the Balkans, there were Jewish communities numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The regime had been pursuing a policy of forced emigration before the war, but emigration was no longer possible. The eastern territories were under German control. There was, the Nazi leadership concluded, only one remaining option. At some point in the autumn or early winter of 1941, almost certainly with Hitler's approval and certainly with Himmler's, the decision was made to murder every Jewish man, woman and child in German-controlled Europe. This was the final solution, the Endlösung, and it was Himmler who was assigned to execute it. The organizational meeting that codified the final solution was held on January 20th, 1942, at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. Reinhard Heydrich convened the conference and chaired it. Adolf Eichmann served as its secretary and produced the minutes. But Heydrich was acting on behalf of Himmler and on explicit authorization from both Himmler and Göring. The Wannsee Conference brought together representatives of every major German government ministry and SS department involved in Jewish policy, and it established a common framework for the murder of 11 million Jews across Europe, the figure provided in the conference's infamous minutes. The meeting lasted no more than 90 minutes. The genocide of an entire people was discussed with the calm procedural language of a government planning session. Transportation requirements were discussed, administrative jurisdictions were clarified, methods were contemplated. The minutes, produced by Eichmann and signed by Heydrich, spoke of evacuation to the east, of natural reduction, of special treatment, bureaucratic euphemisms that everyone present understood to mean murder. Himmler received the minutes. He had set all of this in motion. He was the man who would make it happen. The mechanism Himmler's SS empire developed to carry out the final solution was the network of extermination camps, facilities built specifically and solely for the purpose of mass murder, distinct from the concentration camps which also served as labor facilities. The first extermination camp at Chełmno in occupied Poland began operations in December 1941, using mobile gas vans pumped with carbon monoxide exhaust to kill its victims. It was followed by the camps of Operation Reinhard, named in honor of Reinhard Heydrich after his assassination in May 1942. These camps, at Bełżec, Sobibor and Treblinka, were purpose-built killing centers in eastern Poland, each constructed along similar lines. Jews were transported to the camps by train, typically in sealed cattle wagons without food or water, after journeys that might last several days. Upon arrival, they were told they had arrived at a transit camp and would be deloused before continuing their journey east. They were ordered to undress and surrender their valuables. They were marched down a path that the camp staff called the Tube, or the Road to Heaven, and they were forced into sealed chambers where they were killed, initially by carbon monoxide from diesel engines, and later, at some facilities, by Zyklon B gas. Their bodies were buried in mass graves and later exhumed and burned to destroy the evidence. Treblinka alone killed somewhere between 700,000 and 900,000 people. Bełżec killed approximately 430,000. Sobibor killed approximately 250,000. But the largest and most systematic of all the extermination facilities was Auschwitz-Birkenau in Upper Silesia, which Himmler had visited personally and which he ordered expanded and converted into a combined concentration, forced labor, and extermination camp on a scale unprecedented in human history. Auschwitz was commanded by Rudolf Höss, who had previously commanded the Sachsenhausen concentration camp and who was appointed by Himmler personally. Höss received Himmler at the camp in March 1941 and again in July 1942. During the 1941 visit, Himmler personally ordered the expansion of the camp to hold 100,000 prisoners. During the 1942 visit, he witnessed the gassing of a transport of Jews and the entire process of body disposal and approved it as efficient. He told Höss that Auschwitz was to become the center of the entire extermination program. At its peak, the camp's 4 crematoria and associated gas chambers at Birkenau could kill and cremate more than 4,000 people in a single day. In total, somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 million people were murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The overwhelming majority of them were Jews. Himmler's personal visits to the camps were not rare curiosities. He inspected Auschwitz multiple times. He visited Sobibor in February 1943. He inspected mass grave sites. He received regular statistical reports from his subordinates documenting the progress of the murder program. These reports, which historians have recovered from the Nazi archives, contain tables listing the numbers of Jews killed in different regions, with subtotals and running totals, filed and cross-referenced and stored. In December 1942, Himmler received a summary report from the SS and police leaders in the occupied Soviet territories informing him that 363,211 Jews had been killed in the previous 4 months. The report was marked with Himmler's initials, confirming he had read it. He was not a man who could claim ignorance. He was the manager of genocide, and he managed it with the same diligence he brought to everything else. He was involved not merely at the strategic level, but in operational details. He specified the methods of killing, he authorized the construction of new gas chambers, he decided which groups of prisoners would be allowed to work and which would be killed immediately upon arrival, and he oversaw the system of documentation that recorded the program's progress. The scale of the final solution under Himmler's management is almost impossible to comprehend. In a period of approximately 3.5 years, from late 1941 to the spring of 1945, the SS empire that Himmler commanded murdered approximately 6 million Jews. This figure encompasses the mass shootings of the Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union, the gas chambers of the Operation Reinhard camps, the mass murder at Auschwitz-Birkenau and other combined facilities, the death marches at the end of the war, and the smaller massacres and individual killings that occurred throughout German-occupied Europe. 6 million people, every one of them a human being with a history, a family, a name. The organization that murdered them reported to Heinrich Himmler, but the crimes of Heinrich Himmler extended far beyond even the Holocaust. He was responsible for the deaths of millions of people who were not Jewish through a web of persecution, exploitation, and murder that encompassed virtually every category of person the Nazi regime deemed undesirable. Let us examine some of these crimes in detail, for they deserve to be remembered and understood. The murder of Soviet prisoners of war was one of the most massive crimes of the Second World War, and Himmler bore substantial responsibility for it. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Wehrmacht captured approximately 3.35 million Soviet soldiers in the first 6 months alone. These men were held in conditions of almost inconceivable deprivation. They were housed in open fields surrounded by wire, without shelter, without food, without medical care. They died in their millions from starvation, exposure, and disease. They were also shot in large numbers, particularly those identified as Communist Party members or political commissars under the Commissar Order, which required the immediate execution of all political officers captured with Soviet units. This order had been drafted by the Wehrmacht but enthusiastically enforced by the SS and police units operating in the rear areas, which fell under Himmler's authority. In addition, Himmler's SS ran a separate program of mass executions of Soviet POWs in the concentration camps within Germany, where Soviet officers and soldiers identified as Jews, communist officials, or simply deemed undesirable were taken out and shot in a program codenamed Action 14 F-13. By the end of the war, approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war had died in German captivity. This was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate policy, and much of the enforcement mechanism was Himmler's. The persecution of the Sinti and Roma people, Europe's ancient nomadic minority, was another systematic crime carried out under Himmler's direct authority. Himmler had a particular obsession with the Roma, whom the Nazi racial ideologists classified as racially inferior and asocial. In December 1938, Himmler issued his decree for the struggle against the Gypsy Plague, which established the systematic registration and categorization of all Roma in Germany. In 1941, mass deportations of Roma to Poland began. In December 1942, Himmler issued the order that all Roma in Germany and German-occupied territories were to be deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where a specific section of the camp, known as the Zigeunerlager or Gypsy Camp, was established to hold them. In August 1944, when Himmler determined that the Roma remaining in the Gypsy Camp were no longer useful for labour, he ordered their liquidation. In a single night, August 2nd to 3rd, 1944, approximately 4,300 Roma who remained in the camp were taken to the gas chambers and killed. In total, the Nazi regime murdered between 220,000 and 500,000 Roma, perhaps a quarter to a half of Europe's entire pre-war Roma population. This genocide was organized and implemented by Himmler's SS apparatus. The program of murder that Himmler directed also extended to disabled people within Germany itself. The T4 program, named after the address of its Berlin headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4, was a secret campaign of systematic murder targeting people with physical and mental disabilities. It was officially a program of the Reich Chancellery rather than the SS, and Hitler signed the authorization for it, but Himmler's SS was deeply involved in its implementation, particularly in the East, where SS and police units conducted their own euthanasia killings of disabled people in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, with essentially no bureaucratic constraints at all. Between 1939 and 1941, the T4 program murdered approximately 70,000 to 200,000 disabled people in Germany, in specially constructed killing facilities using carbon monoxide gas, a technology and methodology that was subsequently transferred directly to the extermination camps. The men who designed and operated the T4 gas chambers were later reassigned to build and operate the death camps of Operation Reinhard. The Holocaust grew directly from the T4 program in its technical methodology, and the SS connection ran through both. The persecution of homosexual men in Germany and occupied Europe was another crime of the Himmler apparatus. Himmler was obsessed with homosexuality as a threat to what he described as the numerical strength of the German people, and he pursued the persecution of gay men with particular venom. The SS and Gestapo maintained dedicated units to investigate and arrest gay men. After arrest, gay men could be sent to concentration camps where they were forced to wear a pink triangle identifier and were subjected to especially brutal treatment, including forced labour under conditions specifically designed to kill them. The exact number of gay men murdered in the camp system is debated among historians, with estimates ranging from 5,000 to 15,000. But the scope of persecution was far broader. Tens of thousands were arrested, imprisoned, castrated, or subjected to cruel medical experimentation. Himmler was personally involved in this persecution, issuing detailed instructions about how gay men were to be identified, processed, and punished. He spoke about homosexuality with a mixture of disgust and obsession that went beyond even typical Nazi rhetoric. and he personally authorized experiments in the concentration camps designed, he claimed, to find a biological cure for homosexuality. Himmler's crimes against the peoples of Eastern Europe went beyond the Holocaust and the treatment of prisoners of war. He was also the primary architect of the General Plan Ost, the General Plan for the East, a vast program of ethnic cleansing and colonization that envisioned the removal or murder of between 30 and 45 million Slavic people from their homelands over a period of 20 to 30 years after German victory, to be replaced by German settlers who would colonize the fertile lands of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The plan was detailed, bureaucratic, and utterly monstrous. It called for the starvation or forced removal of the majority of the Polish population, the murder of most of the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, and the transformation of the entire Soviet territory west of the Ural Mountains into a German colonial space. Himmler received and approved drafts of this plan and incorporated it into the overall framework of SS racial policy. While the plan was never fully implemented because Germany ultimately lost the war, significant elements of it were carried out in occupied Poland, where entire Polish villages were destroyed and their populations murdered or expelled to make room for ethnic German settlers. The operation to accomplish this, known as the resettlement program, was managed by Himmler's SS and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians. The medical experiments conducted in the concentration camps represent another category of Himmler's crimes that demands detailed examination. These were not the random cruelties of individual sadists, though there was plenty of sadism involved. They were organized programs of pseudo-scientific research conducted under the authority of the SS, with Himmler's personal knowledge and in many cases with his explicit approval and encouragement. The scale, variety, and deliberate cruelty of these experiments staggers the conscience and reveals something important about the nature of the Himmler Empire, that it had completely dissolved any boundary between science, medicine, ideology, and atrocity. The most extensive single program of medical experiments in the camps was conducted by Josef Mengele at Auschwitz, where he served as the chief physician of the Birkenau camp from May 1943. Mengele is perhaps the most notorious figure among the camp doctors, and he conducted his experiments with a particular enthusiasm and a particular focus on twins and on people with unusual physical characteristics, whom he regarded as living laboratory specimens. He subjected his subjects to injections with bacteria, parasites, and lethal chemicals, to operations performed without anesthetic, to the deliberate infection of one twin with a disease to compare its progression with a healthy twin, and to a range of other procedures designed to investigate the mechanisms of heredity, of racial characteristics, and of disease resistance. When his subjects died, Mengele had their eyes removed and sent to colleagues in Germany. When twins died, he would often kill the surviving twin to enable comparative autopsies. The victims of Mengele's experiments numbered in the hundreds, if not the thousands, and the vast majority did not survive. Mengele had qualified as a physician and held a doctorate in anthropology. He understood exactly what he was doing. Himmler received reports on the results of the medical experiments and encouraged their continuation. But Mengele was only one of many camp doctors conducting experiments on prisoners. At Dachau, prisoners were subjected to hypothermia experiments to determine how long a person could survive immersion in ice water and what methods of rewarming were most effective. These experiments were designed to help the Luftwaffe develop better survival protocols for pilots shot down over the North Sea. The subjects, mostly Soviet prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, were stripped naked and immersed in tanks of ice water or left outside in freezing temperatures in winter. Many died during the experiments. Others were killed afterwards to prevent them from testifying about what had been done to them. The results of the experiments, which cost hundreds of lives, were presented at a medical conference in Nuremberg in October 1942, attended by dozens of German physicians, none of whom objected to the methodology. Himmler was kept informed of the results. At Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin, female prisoners were subjected to surgical experiments ostensibly designed to test treatments for battlefield wound infections. SS physicians made incisions in the legs of healthy women, introduced bacteria, wood shavings, glass fragments, and other materials, then sealed the wounds to simulate battlefield conditions and observed and documented the resulting infections. Some women had their legs broken so that bone graft techniques could be tested. Others had entire muscle groups and nerve tissue removed. Many subjects died. Others were left permanently disabled. Some were subsequently murdered to prevent them from testifying. These experiments were approved by Himmler and were conducted under the direct authority of the SS medical establishment. At Natzweiler Struthof in occupied France, prisoners were subjected to mustard gas experiments to test the effectiveness of various treatments for gas burns. At Buchenwald, prisoners were deliberately infected with typhus, yellow fever, smallpox, and cholera to test experimental vaccines, with mortality rates in the experiments often exceeding 50%. At Neuengamme, prisoners were injected with tuberculosis bacteria to test a proposed vaccine. At Sachsenhausen, prisoners were given poison and then killed and autopsied to measure the lethal dosage. The list goes on. Crime after crime, camp after camp, each experiment approved by the SS medical bureaucracy that reported to Himmler, each producing its meticulous records in the best German administrative tradition, records of suffering and death filed alongside routine administrative correspondence. Perhaps the most grotesque of all the medical programs connected to Himmler was the skeleton collection of the University of Strasbourg. In August 1942, Himmler approved a proposal submitted by SS Hauptsturmführer August Hirt, a professor of anatomy at the Reich University in Strasbourg, to assemble a collection of Jewish skeletons for research purposes. Hirt argued that while comprehensive anthropological studies had been conducted on all other races, Jewish racial characteristics had never been properly catalogued in skeletal form. The solution was simple in the grotesque logic of the Nazi racial state. 150 Jewish prisoners were to be selected from Auschwitz, transported to Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp near Strasbourg, and murdered so that their skeletons could be cleaned and measured for Hirt's collection. The 150 subjects, 115 men and 29 women, and 6 Asiatics, as the SS documentation described them, were selected at Auschwitz by Mengele himself. They were transported to Natzweiler in June and July 1943 and killed in the gas chamber there. Their bodies were transported to Hirt's anatomy laboratory at the university, where they were stored in vats of alcohol. When Allied forces approached Strasbourg in 1944, Hirt attempted to have the evidence destroyed. He largely failed, and the partially defleshed bodies were found by Allied soldiers. Hirt himself fled and was later found dead, apparently a suicide, in 1945. The skeleton collection project had Himmler's personal approval from its inception. He had signed off on the murder of 150 people for the purpose of measuring their bones. The forced sterilization and human experimentation programs aimed at finding a mass method of sterilization represent yet another dimension of Himmler's crimes. In 1942, Himmler received a proposal from SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Pokorny, drawing on research by a botanist named Gerhard Madaus, suggesting that a plant extract from the South American plant Caladium sanguinum could cause permanent sterility if ingested or injected. Pokorny proposed that the substance could be introduced into the food supply of the Jewish prisoners and other groups the Nazis wished to sterilize, allowing millions to be rendered incapable of reproduction without their knowledge. Himmler responded with enthusiasm and authorized research to develop the method. Meanwhile, a parallel program of forced sterilization using X-rays was conducted at the camps. The physician Horst Schumann conducted experiments at Auschwitz in which prisoners, overwhelmingly Jewish, were exposed to high doses of radiation to the reproductive organs and subsequently subjected to operations to verify that the sterilization had been effective. The subjects suffered severe radiation burns and many died from complications. The goal of these experiments was the development of a technique that could be used to covertly sterilize millions of people, a technology of genocide at the biological level. Alongside the death camps and the medical experiments, Himmler oversaw another massive and largely forgotten crime: the exploitation of concentration camp prisoners as slave labor for German industry. As the war progressed and German manpower became increasingly stretched, the SS became a labor supplier, hiring out concentration camp prisoners to German corporations in exchange for payments that went directly to the SS. The firms that used concentration camp labor included some of the most prominent names in German industry. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate, built a synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz specifically to take advantage of the virtually free labor supply available from the camp, and prisoners worked at the plant in conditions so brutal that the mortality rate was extraordinarily high. Volkswagen, BMW, Messerschmitt, Daimler-Benz, and dozens of other major companies used concentration camp workers in their factories. The SS leased these workers at rates of between 3 and 6 Reichsmarks per worker per day, of which the prisoners themselves received nothing. At the same time, the prisoners were deliberately worked to death. The SS doctrine, known by the chilling phrase Vernichtung durch Arbeit, or extermination through work, held that certain categories of prisoners should be assigned to the heaviest labour under the worst conditions and provided with minimal food so that they would be exhausted and killed by the labour itself. This represented an intersection of economic exploitation and murder that was uniquely characteristic of Himmler's SS empire. The SS simultaneously extracted maximum economic value from its prisoners and killed them in the process, then replaced them with new transports. The profits from the slave labour system enriched the SS as an institution and funded its expansion. The network of forced labour that Himmler commanded extended far beyond the concentration camps themselves. By 1944, millions of civilians from occupied countries throughout Europe had been forcibly brought to Germany to work as slave labourers in German industry and agriculture. This program was nominally organised through the office of Fritz Sauckel, the plenipotentiary general for labour deployment, but the SS and police forces under Himmler's command were the primary mechanism for rounding up and transporting forced labourers, and the enforcement of the labour regime fell substantially on Himmler's apparatus. Workers who attempted to escape were shot or sent to concentration camps. Those who refused to work were subjected to brutal punishment. The conditions in which many foreign forced labourers were kept were deliberately degrading, particularly for workers classified as Untermenschen, subhumans, from the Soviet Union and Poland, who were required to wear identifying badges, were forbidden to use public transport or certain public spaces, and were subject to severe punishment for the smallest infraction. By the war's end, approximately 13.5 million foreign civilians and prisoners of war had been subjected to forced labour in Germany, making it one of the largest systems of slave labour in modern history. Himmler's apparatus was instrumental in creating, maintaining and enforcing this system. The shooting operations conducted by the SS and police units under Himmler's command also targeted a wide range of non-Jewish victims in the occupied territories of the East. The entire program of anti-partisan warfare in occupied Yugoslavia, Greece and the Soviet Union was characterized by the deliberate murder of civilian hostages on a massive scale. Himmler's SS and police units operated on the principle that for every German soldier killed by partisans, a fixed number of local civilians would be shot in reprisal. The ratio varied. Sometimes it was 100 civilians for every German, sometimes 50, sometimes 10. The people selected for reprisal shootings were typically taken from among the village population nearest to where the partisan attack had occurred, regardless of whether they had any connection to partisan activity. This practice was not only a war crime under the laws of war as they existed in 1941, but was recognized as such at the time by at least some German military lawyers. Himmler did not care. He issued orders authorizing and encouraging reprisal killings, set the ratios, and received reports detailing their implementation. In Yugoslavia, Himmler's SS and police units, working alongside Wehrmacht formations and with the cooperation of local collaborationist forces, murdered hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, Roma and Croats in operations that combined ideological mass murder with the suppression of resistance. The Ustaše regime in Croatia, which Germany helped install and which Himmler maintained close contact with through the SS advisory mission, carried out an independent program of genocide against Serbs and Jews that killed several 100,000 people in conditions of particular barbarity, including the operation of their own concentration camps, of which Jasenovac was the most notorious. Himmler met repeatedly with Ustaše leaders and provided them with organizational advice and ideological encouragement. In Greece, the deportation of the Salonika Jewish community in the spring of 1943, one of the largest and most ancient Jewish communities in the world, was carried out by Eichmann's office in coordination with local SS and police forces, resulting in the murder of approximately 54,000 Greek Jews at Auschwitz. Himmler's apparatus organized the transports. The Waffen-SS, the military arm of Himmler's empire, was responsible for a series of specific atrocities on both the Western and Eastern fronts that added further dimensions to the catalogue of Himmler's crimes. In France in May 1940, the 1st SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler massacred approximately 80 British prisoners of war at Wormhout, shooting and grenade-killing soldiers who had surrendered. In June 1944, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, responding to partisan activity in the Corrèze region, entered the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, herded the entire population of approximately 650 men, women and children into barns and the village church, and burned them alive after shooting those who tried to escape. The village was then looted and destroyed. Only a handful of people survived. Not a single member of the village had any connection to the partisan attack that supposedly prompted the reprisal. The Oradour massacre was characteristic of Waffen-SS conduct, disproportionate, deliberately terroristic, and lethal to uninvolved civilians. Himmler's Waffen-SS was responsible for similar atrocities across the occupied East, where the massacres of civilians were so numerous and so routine as to be almost uncatalogued. On the Eastern Front, Waffen-SS divisions participated in the Ponary massacre near Vilnius in Lithuania, where approximately 100,000 Jews and others were murdered in a ravine between 1941 and 1944. They participated in the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto in April and May 1943, when the SS and police forces under SS Gruppenführer Jürgen Stroop liquidated the ghetto in response to the Jewish uprising, killing approximately 7,000 Jews in the fighting and sending approximately 56,000 survivors to the Treblinka extermination camp. Himmler personally ordered the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto after the uprising broke out and received daily reports from Stroop on its progress. He also ordered the Warsaw Ghetto itself to be levelled brick by brick after its liquidation, a deliberate act of erasure. In August 1944, as the Warsaw Uprising, a separate rising of the Polish non-Jewish population, erupted in the city, Himmler gave orders that every inhabitant of Warsaw was to be killed and the city was to be completely destroyed. His SS units carried out mass murders of Warsaw civilians during the suppression of the uprising, including the Wola massacre of August 5 to 12, 1944, in which SS and police units under SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski murdered between 40,000 and 50,000 Polish civilians, mostly women and children, in a systematic block-by-block massacre designed to terrorize the population into submission. Himmler had personally assigned Bach-Zelewski to suppress the uprising and had authorized him to use any methods necessary. What made Himmler's personal role in all of this so particularly significant was not merely that he commanded the apparatus, but that he was deeply, personally engaged with the ideology that drove it. He was not a reluctant executioner following orders from above. He was a true believer, a man who had constructed an elaborate pseudo-mystical worldview in which the murder of millions was not merely necessary but cosmically justified, even beautiful in its terrible way. He believed genuinely and deeply in the existence of a Jewish Bolshevik world conspiracy intent on destroying the Aryan race. He believed genuinely in the racial hierarchy he had helped construct, in which Germanic peoples were superior to all others, and certain groups were simply parasitic organisms to be eliminated. He believed that he was engaged in a world historical struggle for the survival of civilization itself, and that the murders he ordered were acts of historical necessity. This was not cynical calculation, it was fanaticism, and it distinguished him from the bureaucratic careerists who carried out his orders without necessarily sharing his convictions. Himmler's personal fascination with the mystic, quasi-religious dimensions of SS ideology was another aspect of his character that deserves attention. He had a deep and sincere interest in Germanic paganism, in Arthurian legend, in runic symbolism, in astrology, and in alternative medicine including herbalism and homeopathy. He corresponded with astrologers and herbalists. He was deeply interested in the supposed history of the Aryan race and commissioned SS archaeological expeditions to find evidence of ancient Germanic civilizations. He created the Ahnenerbe, the SS Ancestral Heritage Organization, which employed several hundred researchers tasked with finding scientific and historical evidence to validate Nazi racial ideology. The Ahnenerbe funded expeditions to Tibet, to Iceland, to Scandinavia, and to South America, looking for traces of an ancient Aryan civilization. It also participated in the medical experiments at the camps, providing institutional cover for some of the more grotesque pseudo-scientific projects. Himmler's interest in these matters was not peripheral. He invested enormous personal energy in them, and they formed part of the ideological framework through which he justified to himself the crimes he was committing. In his mind, he was not simply a mass murderer. He was a guardian of civilization, a warrior in a cosmic struggle, a priest of a new Germanic order. The Wewelsburg Castle in the Teutoburg Forest in Westphalia was the physical expression of this mystical dimension of Himmler's ideology. He had acquired the 13th century castle in 1934 and proceeded to spend enormous sums, partly using concentration camp prisoner labour, turning it into an SS ceremonial centre. The north tower of the castle was redesigned as a sort of SS temple, with a circular hall of the supreme SS leaders, in which 12 SS generals would gather around a round table in deliberate imitation of the Arthurian legend, with Himmler as the Aryan king Arthur. The crypt beneath the hall was intended as a burial chamber for SS leaders. The castle contained a vast library assembled by the Ahnenerbe, extensive collections of SS weaponry and regalia, and living quarters for Himmler himself. He spent weekends there conducting what he described as working sessions with senior SS leaders, which combined administrative meetings with ceremonial rituals whose exact nature remains somewhat obscure, but which involved elements of pseudo-pagan worship, communal meditation, and the reading of Germanic mythology. The total cost of the Wewelsburg project exceeded 12 million Reichsmarks, and it was funded in part by the slave labour of concentration camp prisoners, hundreds of whom died during its construction. The personal life of Heinrich Himmler presents another layer of complexity and hypocrisy. He presented himself publicly as the embodiment of the virtues he preached to the SS: loyalty, discipline, racial purity, and family values. He was married to Margaret Sigrun Boden, a nurse 8 years his senior, whom he had met in 1927 and married in 1928. They had a daughter, Gudrun, born in 1929, of whom Himmler was notoriously fond, calling her Püppi, his little doll, and maintaining daily telephone contact when they were apart. He kept meticulous journals recording his daily activities and his impressions of the world. He presented himself as an exemplary family man, a respectable bourgeois administrator who happened to oversee an empire of murder. But the private reality was considerably different. By the late 1930s, the marriage had effectively broken down. Himmler had taken a mistress, his personal secretary Hedwig Potthast, whom he called Häschen, Little Rabbit. She bore him 2 children, a son, Helga, born in February 1942, and a daughter, Nanette Dorothea, born in July 1944. Himmler maintained both a wife and a mistress simultaneously, living a life of what he apparently saw as entirely unproblematic hypocrisy. He set up Hedwig in a comfortable house, provided generously for their children, and continued to present his family life to the outside world as a model of SS virtue. His wife Margaret, for her part, appears to have been aware of the relationship but powerless to do anything about it. Himmler's relationship with food and personal habits was also revealing. He suffered chronically from stomach ailments and headaches and was obsessed with alternative and natural medicine, consuming large quantities of herbal remedies, mineral waters, and various health preparations. He was a devotee of the quack physician Felix Kirsten, a Finnish masseur who claimed to be able to relieve Himmler's debilitating stomach cramps through massage, and who in the later years of the war used his unique access to Himmler to negotiate on behalf of concentration camp prisoners, securing the release of several thousand people. Kirsten later claimed, with some plausibility, that Himmler confided in him extensively during these massage sessions, revealing the psychological stresses of running an organization responsible for the murder of millions, stresses that Himmler apparently managed through a combination of self-justification and willful compartmentalization. He appears to have been able to discuss the mass murders of the final solution in one breath and his plans for his herb garden in the next. The ability to maintain this compartmentalization, to remain a functioning human being while overseeing industrialized genocide, is perhaps one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of Himmler's character. The question of what Himmler actually thought and felt about the crimes he ordered has fascinated historians for generations. His speeches to SS leaders offer the most direct window into his thinking. The most revealing of these is the speech he delivered to SS generals at Posen on October 4, 1943, which was recorded on a gramophone disc and survived the war to become one of the most extraordinary documents of the Nazi period. In this speech, speaking openly about the mass murder of Jews in a way that was almost never done outside the most restricted circles, Himmler addressed his SS generals directly about the final solution. He told them that he was going to be completely frank with them about something that they never spoke of publicly. He said, "The Jewish people are to be exterminated. Every member of our party says, of course, it's in our program. The elimination of the Jews. Extermination, yes, we'll do it." And then they all come along. 80 million good Germans, and each one of them has his decent Jew. It's clear the others are pigs, but this particular one is first-class Jew. Of all those who speak this way, not one has seen it. Not one has gone through it. Most of you know what it means to see 100 corpses lying together, 500 or 1,000. To have gone through this, and yet, apart from a few exceptions, examples of human weakness, to have remained decent, this is what has made us hard. This is a glorious page in our history that has never been written and will never be written. The Posen speech is devastating in its implications. Himmler was explicitly acknowledging the mass murder of Jews, endorsing it, defending it, and praising those who carried it out. He was doing so in a context in which he expected complete agreement from his audience of senior SS generals, all of whom he knew to be aware of and complicit in the crimes being described. He was presenting genocide as a heroic achievement, as a test of character that his men had passed, as a dark secret that bound together the SS leadership in shared knowledge and shared guilt. And he was doing so in a speech that he must have known would create a historical record, because it was being recorded. He did not fear that record. He expected Germany to win the war and was apparently confident that in the triumphant Germany he anticipated, this speech would be regarded as the frank acknowledgement of a necessary historical act, rather than a confession of mass murder. The speech also reveals something about Himmler's relationship to the concept of conscience. He acknowledged that witnessing mass murder was difficult, that some SS men had shown human weakness in the face of it, but he reframed that difficulty as a burden heroically borne, rather than a moral signal to be heeded. In his worldview, the revulsion that normal human beings feel when confronted with mass death was a weakness to be overcome, rather than a warning to be listened to. He had trained himself and his organization to overcome it, and he was proud of that achievement. This is the psychology of a man who had systematically destroyed his own moral sense in the service of an ideology, and it is the psychology that made him uniquely dangerous. The later years of the war saw Himmler's power reach its zenith, even as the military situation deteriorated catastrophically. Hitler, whose trust in the Wehrmacht generals had collapsed after years of frustration, increasingly turned to Himmler as the most reliable instrument of his will. In August 1943, Hitler appointed Himmler as Minister of the Interior of the Reich, giving him formal control over domestic German civil administration to add to his existing command of the police, the SS, and the concentration camp empire. After the July 20th, 1944 bomb plot against Hitler, in which a group of Wehrmacht officers placed a bomb in Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia in an attempt to kill the Führer, Himmler was appointed commander of the Reserve Army, the replacement army responsible for training and deploying new units within Germany. This gave him direct command of substantial conventional military forces for the first time. He was now simultaneously the head of the SS, the chief of German police, the Minister of the Interior, the commander of the Reserve Army, and the overseer of the final solution. Never in the history of the Third Reich had so much power been concentrated in the hands of a single individual outside Hitler himself. After the July 20th plot was suppressed, it was Himmler's SS that conducted the investigation and the reprisals. The People's Court, presided over by the fanatical judge Roland Freisler, tried the conspirators in show trials that were filmed at Himmler's initiative, so that Hitler could watch the humiliation of his enemies. The conspirators were hanged on meat hooks with piano wire, a method of execution deliberately chosen for its cruelty and humiliation. Himmler had photographs taken of the executions and presented them to Hitler. He also extended the persecution beyond the immediate conspirators to encompass their families, implementing the principle he called Sippenhaft, kin liability, under which the relatives of traitors were themselves arrested and punished. Hundreds of family members of the July 20th conspirators, including children, were arrested and sent to concentration camps or placed in protective custody. This was Himmler's application of a principle he had argued for consistently throughout his career, that the family of a person who betrayed the SS or the Nazi state bore collective responsibility for the betrayal. It was a principle borrowed from the ancient Germanic tribal law that he so romanticized, and it was one that resulted in the persecution of entirely innocent people for the crimes of their relatives. In the autumn and winter of 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and Allied forces pushed from the west, Himmler received another appointment that demonstrated both Hitler's faith in him and his own considerable ambition: command of Army Group Vistula, a major German military formation tasked with defending the eastern approaches to Berlin against the Soviet advance. This was a remarkable appointment for a man with virtually no operational military experience, and it turned out to be a disaster. Himmler had no understanding of mobile warfare and no ability to manage the complex operational problems involved in commanding a major formation against the overwhelming Soviet offensive. He spent much of his time in his command train, where Kirsten continued to treat his stomach cramps and where he reportedly spent considerable time conferring with his astrologer. By February 1945, it was apparent even to Hitler that Himmler was incapable of commanding the army group, and he was replaced. It was one of the rare occasions in the war when Hitler acknowledged a failure of one of his senior Nazi officials, though even then he did not publicly humiliate Himmler. The appointment to command Army Group Vistula was revealing in another way. By late 1944, Himmler had begun to develop a secret agenda entirely his own. He was considering the possibility of negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies. As early as the summer of 1944, he had begun to hold cautious discussions with intermediaries who suggested that the Western powers might be willing to deal with a Germany that had disposed of Hitler and replaced him with a more reasonable leadership. Himmler, it seemed, had decided that he was the person who should lead that new Germany. A decision that required a breathtaking degree of either self-delusion or moral blindness, since he was at that moment personally responsible for the deaths of millions of people and was one of the most wanted men in Europe. But he appears to have genuinely believed that the Western Allies, confronted with the Soviet threat in Central Europe, would be willing to set aside the crimes of the Nazi regime and accept Himmler as a partner against communism. In February 1945, Himmler held a secret meeting with the World Jewish Congress representative Norbert Masur and with Felix Kirsten, during which he agreed to release 2,700 Jewish women from Ravensbrück concentration camp. This gesture, which saved the lives of thousands of prisoners, is sometimes cited as evidence of Himmler's capacity for humanity, but it must be understood in context. It occurred at a moment when Himmler was desperately trying to establish his credentials as a potential negotiating partner with the West, and it was accompanied by continued killing at the other camps. The same Himmler who released the Ravensbrück prisoners in February 1945 was issuing orders in March 1945 that concentration camp prisoners should not be allowed to fall into Allied hands alive. Orders that resulted in the infamous death marches, in which tens of thousands of camp prisoners, already emaciated and desperately ill, were forced to march westward away from the advancing Allied forces. Through the winter cold, dying by the tens of thousands along the roads of Germany. The death marches represent one of the last great crimes of the Himmler regime, and one of the most gratuitous. By the beginning of 1945, it was obvious to virtually everyone that Germany had lost the war. The camps in the east were being evacuated as the Soviet forces advanced, and the logical humanitarian course would have been to leave the prisoners in place and allow them to be liberated by the advancing armies. Instead, Himmler ordered the evacuation of the camps, compelling the prisoners to march westward, often for hundreds of kilometers, through freezing weather, without adequate food, clothing, or shelter. Guards shot anyone who fell behind. The marching columns left trails of corpses along the roads of Germany and Austria. Estimates of the number of people who died on the death marches range from 250,000 to 375,000. Many of these deaths occurred in the last weeks and months of the war, when it served absolutely no military purpose and when the prisoners had already survived years of brutal captivity. The death marches were an act of pure extermination, carried out of ideological compulsion even as the regime was collapsing, and they were ordered by Himmler. In April 1945, Himmler took the step that would seal his historical disgrace even within the Nazi inner circle. Meeting secretly with the Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, a representative of the International Red Cross, at the Swedish consulate in Lübeck on the night of April 23rd to 24th, 1945, Himmler proposed that Germany should surrender to the Western Allies, with himself as the representative of a new German government, while continuing to fight the Soviet Union. He asked Bernadotte to convey this proposal to General Dwight Eisenhower. The proposal was, of course, absurd. The Western Allies had been clear that they would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender from all parties, and they had no intention of negotiating with Himmler or of separating their war from that of the Soviet Union. Bernadotte transmitted the proposal, but it was rejected immediately. When the news reached Hitler on April 28th, he exploded in rage. He declared Himmler a traitor and stripped him of all his offices and positions. He ordered Himmler's arrest. The man who had been the second most powerful figure in the Third Reich, the man who had run Hitler's most cherished ideological project for 16 years, was condemned by the man he had served as a traitor. Hitler died in his Berlin bunker 2 days later on April 30th, 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. Himmler was without power, without authority, and in hiding. He had shaved off his moustache, donned the uniform of a secret field policeman, and acquired false papers identifying him as Heinrich Himmler, a minor police official. On May 21st, he joined a group of displaced German soldiers attempting to move through Allied checkpoints in northern Germany, accompanied by 2 aides. His false papers were not good enough to pass the Allied checkpoints that had been set up specifically to catch fleeing SS men. On May 22, 1945, he was arrested by British soldiers at a checkpoint near Bremerwörde. He was not immediately identified. It was only when he was taken to a British interrogation centre at Barnstedt and a senior British officer arrived to question him that Himmler removed his eye patch, put on his spectacles, and identified himself. He was the most wanted man in Europe, and he had been captured without a fight, wearing a disguise, carrying fake papers. The British officers who took Himmler into custody on May 22, 1945, were confronted with an extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable situation. They had in their hands the man who had overseen the murder of millions of people, the man who had created and commanded the SS, the Gestapo, the concentration camp system, the Einsatzgruppen. He was one of the most notorious criminals in all of human history, and he was sitting in front of them wearing a disguise and giving his name as Himmler. The British field security officer responsible for the arrest, Captain Tom Sylvester, later described Himmler as looking small and insignificant in person, completely unimpressive, the kind of man you would not look twice at. He was cooperative, even ingratiating. He asked for a private meeting with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, apparently still believing that he was a figure of sufficient importance to negotiate his own fate. He was not treated gently. He was stripped and searched, his belongings were removed, and he was given a British Army uniform to wear. He was taken to a British interrogation facility in Lüneburg for a more thorough examination. During the examination at Lüneburg on the evening of May 23, 1945, the British doctor conducting the physical check noticed that Himmler was holding his mouth in an unusual position, possibly concealing something between his teeth or in his cheek. The doctor reached into Himmler's mouth to check, and Himmler bit down. He had a small glass vial of potassium cyanide crushed between his teeth. The doctor immediately attempted to induce vomiting and called for medical assistance, but the cyanide acted within seconds. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, Chief of the German Police, Minister of the Interior, Commander of the Reserve Army, Overseer of the Final Solution, died on the floor of a British interrogation facility in Lüneburg at approximately 11:14 in the evening of May 23, 1945. He was 44 years old. He had evaded not the justice he deserved, but the opportunity to be confronted with the full weight of his crimes before a court of law. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the countryside outside Lüneburg. The British deliberately kept the location secret, and it remained unknown to the public for decades. It was discovered in 1992 by a British historian working in the Lüneburg area who identified it through a combination of historical records and physical examination. The grave contained the skeletal remains of a male individual in his 40s, along with physical evidence consistent with Himmler's known characteristics. The exact location remains unpublicized to prevent it from becoming a site of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. The death of Himmler by suicide deprived the Nuremberg trials of what would have been their most significant defendant. Hermann Göring, who was present at Nuremberg, had been Himmler's rival for power within the Third Reich and had considerably less direct involvement in the final solution, though Göring's signature appears on the July 1941 document commissioning Heydrich to prepare the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe. Rudolf Hess, also present at Nuremberg, had been in British captivity since 1941 and had no direct involvement in the wartime crimes. The generals present, including Keitel and Jodl, were significant criminals in their own right but were not the primary architects of the Holocaust. That primary architect, the man who had designed and managed the entire enterprise of systematic murder, had died on the floor of a British interrogation room with a cyanide capsule, and the world was denied the opportunity to hear him account for his actions. What might Himmler have said? We have some indication from his conversations with Kirsten, from the Posen speech, and from the handful of other documented statements he made about the final solution. He believed he would be vindicated by history. He believed that posterity would recognize that the destruction of the Jewish people had been historically necessary for the survival of European civilization. He believed that future generations of Germanic peoples would look back on what he had done with gratitude, not horror. In this belief, of course, he could not have been more catastrophically wrong, but the belief itself is revealing. It suggests that even at the end, even as his world collapsed around him, Himmler had not experienced any genuine moral reckoning with the crimes he had committed. He had not, in any meaningful sense, acknowledged that what he had done was wrong. He had rationalized it, justified it, idealized it, and in his final days he was apparently attempting to leverage it as a political asset, pointing to it as evidence of his effectiveness as a ruler and his willingness to take necessary action, the very qualities he thought the Western Allies should be looking for in a German partner. The legacy of Heinrich Himmler is impossible to assess with anything less than the full weight of the historical record. He was not, as is sometimes claimed, merely a grey bureaucrat who implemented others' decisions without imagination or initiative. The evidence is overwhelming that Himmler was a proactive and creative participant in the development of Nazi racial policy, that he often pushed for more radical measures rather than simply executing instructions from above, and that he brought genuine ideological conviction and personal enthusiasm to the enterprise of genocide. He was the man who created the SS and turned it into the primary instrument of Nazi terror. He was the man who built the concentration camp system from the ground up. He was the man who commanded the Einsatzgruppen and sent them into the Soviet Union with orders to murder Jews. He was the man who presided over the construction of the extermination camps and visited them to approve their operations. He was the man who managed the logistics of the final solution and received the statistical reports on its progress. He was the man who ordered the death marches in the final months of the war. At every stage of the Nazi regime's worst crimes, Himmler was not a bystander. He was the organizer, the administrator, the enabler, and the driving force. The sheer scale of the human catastrophe that Himmler was responsible for is almost beyond comprehension. The most conservative estimates suggest that the apparatus he commanded was responsible for the deaths of at least 6 million Jews and an additional 5 to 6 million non-Jews, including Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, Roma, people with disabilities, political prisoners, homosexuals, and a wide range of others persecuted by the Nazi regime. This means that Himmler's organization killed at least 11 million people, and possibly considerably more if the broader category of deaths attributable to the working conditions he imposed on forced laborers, the reprisal killings in occupied territories, and the indirect deaths from exposure, starvation, and disease in the camps are included. Some historians place the figure attributable to the SS empire at 15 million or higher. Whatever the precise number, it represents a crime of a magnitude that has rarely, if ever, been approached in human history, and it was committed under the management of a single individual over a period of approximately 4 years. How is it possible to understand a man like Himmler? Historians and psychologists have grappled with this question for generations without arriving at a satisfying answer. He was not obviously insane in the clinical sense. He functioned effectively in his administrative role. He maintained personal relationships. He experienced what appear to have been genuine emotions, including affection for his daughter, satisfaction in his work, and apparently some form of stress response to the mass killings he witnessed. He was not a sadist in the way that some of his subordinates were sadists. taking personal pleasure in the suffering of victims. He appears to have found the actual physical reality of mass murder distressing, which is why he sought methods that would distance the perpetrators from the act of killing. Methods like the gas chambers, which allowed thousands to be killed without any SS man having to look his victim in the face. But this distress was entirely compatible with his commitment to continuing and expanding the killing program. He was, in the final analysis, a man who had completely subordinated his human instincts to an ideology, who had decided at some level that the abstract demands of racial theory mattered more than the concrete reality of human suffering, and who had then found the institutional and logistical means to act on that decision with catastrophic effectiveness. The SS organization that Himmler built did not simply vanish with Germany's defeat. Its veterans, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, returned to civilian life across Germany, Austria, and the occupied territories. Many of them carried with them knowledge of the crimes they had participated in and a shared interest in ensuring that those crimes were never fully exposed or prosecuted. The networks of former SS men that formed in the post-war period, the most prominent of which was the HIAG organization, worked systematically to rehabilitate the SS's reputation, to argue that the Waffen-SS in particular had been ordinary soldiers fighting for their country rather than ideologically motivated criminals, and to obstruct the prosecution of war criminals where possible. Many former SS officers found their way into the intelligence services of the early Federal Republic and of the United States and the United Kingdom, which found their expertise in anti-communist operations useful during the Cold War and were willing to overlook their wartime crimes. As a consequence, Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the logistics of the deportation of Jews to the extermination camps under Himmler's overall authority, escaped to Argentina using forged papers and lived under the assumed name Ricardo Clement in Buenos Aires until 1960, when Israeli intelligence agents from the Mossad tracked him down, abducted him, and smuggled him to Israel. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961 and hanged in 1962, the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, famously used Eichmann's case to develop her concept of the banality of evil, the idea that great evil is often committed not by demonic monsters but by ordinary, even banal individuals who have simply ceased to think about the moral dimensions of what they are doing. Arendt's analysis has been disputed by subsequent historians, some of whom argue that Eichmann was more ideologically committed to Nazi anti-Semitism than he appeared in the courtroom. But the broader insight that the Holocaust was carried out by ordinary human beings who made specific choices to participate in it has become central to historical understanding of the period. Reinhard Heydrich, the man Himmler described as the man with the iron heart, the deputy who built the SD and ran the Gestapo and chaired the Wannsee Conference, was assassinated on May 27, 1942, by Czech and Slovak paratroopers trained in Britain, who had been parachuted into occupied Czechoslovakia specifically to kill him. He was ambushed while riding in his open-topped staff car in Prague and mortally wounded when a grenade detonated, driving fragments of the car's upholstery and his uniform into his bloodstream, causing blood poisoning from which he died on June 4, 1942. His assassination provoked an extraordinary reprisal from Himmler's SS. The villages of Lidice and Ležáky were suspected of harbouring the assassins. Lidice was surrounded by SS troops. All 173 men and boys were shot. All 184 women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children were gassed or sent to German families for Germanization, and the village was burned to the ground and then dynamited flat. Ležáky suffered a similar fate. The Lidice massacre became one of the most notorious single atrocities of the entire war and a symbol of Nazi collective punishment. Himmler ordered it. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz who had received Himmler's personal visits to the camp and who had implemented the mass murder program there under Himmler's authority, was captured by British forces in 1945, disguised as a farm labourer under an assumed name. He was extradited to Poland, tried before a Polish court for crimes against the Polish nation, convicted, and hanged at Auschwitz on April 16, 1947, on the gallows adjacent to his former residence at the camp. Before his execution, he wrote his memoirs in his prison cell, a document of extraordinary historical significance in which he described the operations of the death camp in meticulous detail and confirmed Himmler's direct personal involvement in ordering and supervising the extermination program. The memoirs were later published as Commandant of Auschwitz and remain one of the essential primary sources for understanding the mechanics of the Holocaust. Odilo Globoknik, the SS Gruppenführer whom Himmler had appointed to implement the Operation Reinhard extermination program in the Lublin district of occupied Poland, responsible for the murder of approximately 1.7 million Jews at Bełżec, Sobibor and Treblinka, was captured by British forces in Austria in May 1945 and committed suicide by taking cyanide before he could be interrogated. Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, escaped to Brazil via the Ratline network and lived there until 1967, when he was tracked down by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal and extradited to West Germany. He was convicted of co-responsibility for the murder of 900,000 people at Treblinka and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1971. His wife, Teresa, whom investigators interviewed in Brazil before his arrest, described her husband's career with remarkable frankness, stating that she had known what was happening at Treblinka and had chosen not to think about it. Her account was published by journalist Gitta Sereni in the book Into That Darkness, one of the most penetrating psychological studies of a perpetrator ever written. The Nuremberg trials, which ran from November 1945 to October 1946, tried 22 major Nazi leaders, though not Himmler, who had already died. Subsequent proceedings at Nuremberg tried 184 additional defendants in 12 separate trials, including the doctor's trial, which prosecuted the physicians who had conducted medical experiments in the camps, and the Einsatzgruppen trial, which prosecuted 24 SS officers responsible for the mobile killing operations in the Soviet Union. All 24 Einsatzgruppen defendants were convicted, 4 were sentenced to death and hanged, and the remainder received prison sentences, most of which were subsequently commuted. The medical case resulted in the conviction of 16 defendants and the execution of 7. It also produced the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles for ethical human experimentation that became the foundation of modern medical ethics and of international standards for research involving human subjects. A horrific irony. The most comprehensive statement of ethical principles for medical research emerged directly from the prosecution of the men who had violated every such principle on an industrial scale. The post-war fate of the men who had served Himmler's empire most directly is a study in the extraordinary inadequacy of post-war justice. Of the approximately 900,000 men who served in some capacity in the Waffen-SS, an organization declared criminal at Nuremberg, the vast majority faced no legal consequences whatsoever. Denazification proceedings classified most of them as minor offenders or merely followers, categories that resulted in fines and temporary employment restrictions rather than imprisonment. By the early 1950s, most former Waffen-SS men had been reintegrated into West German society, were eligible for veterans' pensions, and in many cases had returned to the same professions they had left to join the SS. The contrast with the magnitude of the crimes their organization had committed was stark and, for the survivors of those crimes, deeply painful. The situation was somewhat better with regard to the senior officers of the SS and the operational planners of the Holocaust, though still far from adequate. The Einsatzgruppen commanders received prison sentences, most of which were commuted or cut short. Otto Ohlendorf, the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, who had personally supervised the murder of approximately 90,000 people in the Soviet Union and who testified at Nuremberg with remarkable candor about his unit's activities, was hanged in June 1951. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor as head of the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, which coordinated the SS security and intelligence apparatus, was tried at the main Nuremberg trial, convicted on multiple counts, and hanged in October 1946. Oswald Pohl, who headed the SS Economic Administrative Main Office and was responsible for managing the economic dimension of the concentration camp system, including the slave labour programs, was tried at the Pohl trial at Nuremberg, convicted, and hanged in June 1951. These executions were significant but represented only a fraction of those who bore substantial responsibility for the crimes of the Himmler Empire. A number of the most significant perpetrators escaped justice entirely. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz physician, escaped to Argentina in 1949 and later moved to Paraguay and then Brazil. Despite decades of searching by Nazi hunters, including Simon Wiesenthal and the Israeli Mossad, and despite the enormous public attention given to his case, Mengele was never caught. He died in February 1979 in Embu das Artes, Brazil, when he suffered a stroke while swimming and drowned. His body was initially buried under an assumed name and not identified until 1985, when dental records confirmed the identity of the skeleton. Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon for his activities as Gestapo chief in Lyon, France, where he tortured and killed resistance members and deported Jewish children to the death camps, fled to Bolivia after the war and lived there under an assumed name until 1971, when journalists tracked him down. He was not extradited until 1983, was tried in France in 1987, convicted of crimes against humanity, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991. Alois Brunner, Adolf Eichmann's principal deputy who was responsible for the deportation of Jews from Austria, Greece, France, and Slovakia to the extermination camps, escaped to Syria after the war, where he lived under the assumed name Georg Fischer, apparently working as an advisor to the Syrian government on interrogation and torture techniques. Multiple attempts were made to capture or extradite him, all of which failed due to Syrian government protection. He survived multiple letter bomb attacks sent by Israeli intelligence. He is believed to have died in Syria sometime in the mid-2000s, although the exact date and circumstances of his death have never been confirmed. He was never tried for his crimes. Walter Rauff, the SS officer who designed and supervised the development of the mobile gas vans used to kill Jews and others in the Soviet Union and North Africa, escaped to Chile after the war, where he lived openly under his own name in Santiago, running a crab fishing operation. West German prosecutors sought his extradition in the 1960s, but the Chilean Supreme Court rejected the request, ruling that the statute of limitations had expired under Chilean law for crimes committed before 1945. Rauff died peacefully in Santiago in 1984. His funeral was attended by former members of the German community in Chile, who gave Nazi salutes over his coffin. He had never spent a single day in prison for his crimes. The prosecution of Himmler's crimes through the German legal system itself was a decades-long process of partial success and frequent failure. West Germany began its own systematic prosecution of Nazi crimes in 1958 with the establishment of the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg, known simply as the Zentralstelle. This body coordinated investigations across all German states and identified thousands of suspected war criminals for prosecution. But the legal obstacles were enormous. The West German Statute of Limitations threatened to bar prosecution of murder cases committed more than 20 years previously, and the Bundestag had to repeatedly extend or abolish the limitations period to allow prosecutions to continue. Witnesses had scattered across the world. Evidence was in some cases destroyed. Many of the suspected perpetrators had successfully established new identities and were protected by the reluctance of employers, neighbours, and sometimes even investigators to pursue cases against men who appeared to have become respectable citizens. The Auschwitz trial, held in Frankfurt between December 1963 and August 1965, was the most significant German prosecution of Holocaust crimes and demonstrated both the achievements and the limitations of post-war German justice. 22 defendants, all of them former SS officers who had served at Auschwitz in various capacities, were tried before a Frankfurt court. The trial lasted over 20 months, heard testimony from over 300 witnesses from around the world, and produced a voluminous record of the crimes committed at the camp. 6 defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment, 11 received sentences of varying lengths, 5 were acquitted. The verdicts disappointed many observers who had hoped for more comprehensive convictions and longer sentences. But the trial's lasting significance lay not in the sentences imposed, but in the historical record it created. A detailed, judicially verified account of the operations of the death camp that could never be denied or disputed, based on the testimony of survivors and the meticulous documentation that the SS had itself created. The investigations and prosecutions have continued to the present day. In 2011, the conviction of John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian-born former SS guard who had served at the Sobibor extermination camp for complicity in the murder of 28,060 Jews, established a new legal principle in German law, that serving as a guard at an extermination camp without specific proof of individual killings was sufficient to establish criminal liability. This principle opened the door to the prosecution of the handful of surviving former camp personnel who were still alive, most of whom were in their late 80s or 90s. In 2015, Oskar Grüning, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, who had served at the camp processing the valuables taken from arriving prisoners, was convicted of complicity in murder and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He died in 2018 before his sentence was carried out. In 2016, Reinhold Hanning, another former Auschwitz guard, was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He died in 2017 while his appeal was pending. These late prosecutions, conducted against men in their 90s, created considerable debate about the purpose of criminal justice and whether convicting extremely elderly men for crimes committed 7 decades earlier served any meaningful function. The survivors who testified in these cases had a clear answer. They testified, often in great physical difficulty and at considerable emotional cost, because they believed that historical accountability mattered, that the crimes of Himmler's empire demanded formal acknowledgement by the legal system, and that even a 4-year sentence handed to a 90-year-old man carried a significance beyond its practical effect. The testimony of survivors in all of these trials, from Nuremberg in 1945 to the Frankfurt trials of the 1960s to the late prosecutions of the 2010s, created a historical record of the crimes of the Himmler apparatus that is more detailed, more comprehensive, and more thoroughly authenticated than the record of virtually any other crimes in human history. This record exists because survivors insisted that it should exist, because prosecutors pursued cases that were logistically difficult and politically uncomfortable, and because the crimes themselves were of such overwhelming magnitude that the historical and moral imperative to document them could not be ignored. What happened to Himmler's immediate family? His wife Margarete was subjected to denazification proceedings after the war. In 1953, she was classified as a profiteer of the Nazi regime and sentenced to 30 days of forced labor, a penalty that was almost grotesquely inadequate given the nature and scale of her husband's crimes, but which reflected the limited legal options available for the prosecution of spouses who had not themselves committed specific criminal acts. She subsequently lived under the pseudonym Marguerite Baudin until her death in 1967, attempting to distance herself from her past, but never fully succeeding. Himmler's daughter Gudrun, whom he had adored and called Püppi, became one of the most prominent and determined defenders of the SS legacy in post-war Germany. She maintained for the rest of her life that her father had been a good man and a good father, that the crimes attributed to him were either fabricated or exaggerated, and that he had been killed by the British rather than having committed suicide. She was for decades one of the most active members of Stille Hilfe, the silent aid organization that provided financial and legal support to convicted or fugitive SS men and their families. She attended meetings of far-right organizations, provided character references for convicted war criminals, and used her surname carefully as a legitimizing presence in neo-Nazi networks. She died in May 2018 at the age of 88, without ever publicly acknowledging the reality of her father's crimes. Himmler's illegitimate son, Helge, born to his mistress Hedwig Potthast in 1942, attempted to live as anonymously as possible after the war. His sister Nanette Dorothea, born in 1944, adopted the surname von Wiese after the war, and similarly sought distance from her father's identity. Their mother Hedwig, who had been Himmler's devoted companion during the most active years of the Holocaust, was never prosecuted for any crime. She died in 1994. The descendants of Himmler's family have largely sought obscurity, though Gudrun's persistent public presence as a defender of her father's memory ensured that the name Himmler remained associated with controversy and denial until well into the 21st century. The physical sites of Himmler's crimes have themselves become part of the ongoing engagement with his legacy. Auschwitz-Birkenau, preserved as a museum and memorial by the Polish government since 1947, receives over 2 million visitors per year. The preserved barracks, the ruins of the gas chambers dynamited by the retreating SS in January 1945, the vast collection of physical objects taken from the victims, including hundreds of thousands of shoes, eyeglasses, and suitcases, and the documentation preserved in the camp archives constitute a physical record of Himmler's crimes that affects visitors from around the world with an immediacy that no book or documentary film can fully replicate. The camp was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979, a designation that generated considerable controversy, but which ultimately reflected the international community's commitment to preserving the evidence of what was done there as a permanent reminder of human capacity for organized evil. Dachau, the first concentration camp that Himmler had opened with a press conference in March 1933, was opened as a memorial and museum in 1965. The Buchenwald Memorial, Sachsenhausen Memorial, and the memorials at the sites of the Operation Reinhard death camps at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka all serve similar functions. The Treblinka Memorial, in particular, is a remarkable and deeply affecting place, because the camp was almost entirely dismantled and its grounds ploughed over by the retreating SS in a desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of what had happened there, and because the bodies of the approximately 900,000 people murdered there were exhumed and burned and the ashes scattered, there are almost no physical remains. The memorial consists of thousands of rough stones arranged across the former campsite, each bearing the name of a country or region from which the victims were deported, a landscape of rock and silence that speaks more powerfully than any more elaborate monument to the thoroughness of the destruction and the enormity of the loss. The Wannsee House in Berlin, where the Wannsee Conference was held on January 20th, 1942, is now the Haus der Wannsee-Konferenz, the House of the Wannsee Conference, a memorial and educational centre that preserves the minutes of the conference and offers historical context for their significance. It is, in its quiet lakeside setting with its well-appointed conference rooms, a deliberately dissonant place, a building that looks like a comfortable upper-class villa maintained as it was in 1942, in which the administrative framework for the murder of 11 million people was established in 90 minutes over a working lunch. The house receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. German school children visit it as part of their mandatory Holocaust education curriculum. Germany's approach to Holocaust education and commemoration has become in many ways a model for the world. The German Basic Law, the post-war constitution, contains specific provisions protecting human dignity that were drafted with the Nazi crimes directly in mind. The teaching of Holocaust history is mandatory in German schools. The display of Nazi symbols is a criminal offence under German law. The German government has paid substantial reparations to the State of Israel and to individual Holocaust survivors, with the total amount paid since 1952 exceeding €70 billion. The Stumbling Stone Project, initiated by artist Günter Demnig in 1996, has installed over 75,000 small brass plaques in the pavements outside the last known homes of Holocaust victims across Europe, each bearing the victim's name, date of birth, and fate. The largest decentralized memorial in the world. These are not the achievements of a society that has forgotten what Himmler's empire did. They are the achievements of a society that has made the decision to remember, to teach, and to ensure that the victims are not reduced to anonymous statistics. Yet the struggle against forgetting, denial, and the rehabilitation of Nazi criminals continues to require vigilance. Holocaust denial, the claim that the murder of 6 million Jews did not occur or has been grossly exaggerated, remains a significant phenomenon in various parts of the world, despite being a criminal offence in many European countries. In Germany, Austria, France, Belgium, Canada, and other countries, Holocaust denial is punishable by imprisonment. Online platforms have struggled to control Holocaust denial content, which proliferates in the darker corners of the internet alongside related forms of anti-Semitism and neo-Nazi ideology. In some Eastern European countries, historical narratives that minimize local participation in the Holocaust and focus exclusively on German perpetrators have been promoted for political reasons, creating diplomatic tensions and complicating the comprehensive historical understanding of how Himmler's murder machine operated in practice, which depended extensively on the collaboration of local populations, police forces, and auxiliary military units throughout occupied Europe. The crimes of Heinrich Himmler must also be understood in terms of what they revealed about modernity itself. The Holocaust was not a reversion to primitive barbarism. It was, in a deeply troubling sense, an ultra-modern crime. It used the latest industrial technology, trains, chemicals, purpose-built facilities, assembly line processes. It used modern administrative techniques, bureaucratic organization, chain of command, statistical reporting, record keeping. It used modern communications, telephones, telegrams, radio. It used modern science, or at least a grotesque parody of it, to justify its ideological premises and develop its methods. Himmler's empire was, in the most literal sense, the product of the same organizational and technological capacities that drove German industrial and military success in the 20th century. The same qualities that made German industry efficient, that made the German military effective, that made German bureaucracy orderly, those same qualities were channeled through the ideology of Nazism into an apparatus of mass murder. This is one of the reasons why the Holocaust continues to disturb, not because it was the product of a uniquely evil people, but because it demonstrated what any people under certain circumstances, with certain leadership, might be capable of. The question of individual moral responsibility within the Himmler Empire is one that historians and ethicists continue to debate. Christopher Browning's 1992 study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of ordinary middle-aged Hamburg policemen who were assigned to mass shooting operations in occupied Poland and murdered approximately 38,000 Jews over a period of months, demonstrated that the men who carried out the actual killings were, in most cases, not SS ideologues or specially selected fanatics, but ordinary people who had been placed in extraordinary circumstances, and had, in the overwhelming majority, chosen to participate in mass murder rather than exercise the option to opt out, which their commanders actually offered them. Very few of the men chose to step aside. The implications of this finding are deeply uncomfortable. If ordinary men could become mass murderers in the right circumstances, the uniqueness of the perpetrator's psychology is undermined, and the question of what distinguishes those who kill from those who refuse to becomes both more urgent and more difficult to answer. Himmler himself addressed this question in a different way. He chose not to allow doubt or conscience to develop within the SS by the simple expedient of selecting for membership only those who had demonstrated their commitment to Nazi ideology by conducting intensive indoctrination designed to replace ordinary moral intuitions with ideological ones, by creating an organizational culture in which participation in atrocity was rewarded and dissent was punished, and by ensuring that knowledge of the worst crimes was distributed widely enough within the organization to create a community of complicity that bound its members together through shared guilt. This was not accidental. It was deliberate policy, designed by a man who understood enough about human psychology to know that making everyone complicit was the most effective way of ensuring that no one would break ranks. The international dimension of the hunt for Himmler's former subordinates extended across decades and across continents, involving intelligence services, governments, private organizations, and individual investigators whose determination to bring war criminals to justice drove some of the most remarkable detective work in history. Simon Wiesenthal, himself a survivor of multiple concentration camps including Mauthausen, devoted the remainder of his life after liberation to tracking down former Nazi war criminals. Working from his Jewish documentation center in Vienna, Wiesenthal compiled dossiers on hundreds of suspects and cooperated with law enforcement agencies around the world to facilitate arrests and prosecutions. He was instrumental in locating Adolf Eichmann, in tracking down Franz Stangl of Treblinka, and in the eventual identification and prosecution of dozens of other former SS personnel. He died in 2005 at the age of 96, having spent 60 years pursuing the men who had served Himmler. His foundation, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, continues his work today. The Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, conducted its own operations against former Nazi criminals with methods that ranged from the meticulous intelligence work that located Eichmann to operations that resulted in targeted killings of figures deemed particularly dangerous or impossible to bring to trial by other means. The unit known as Operation Wrath of God, better known from its later targeting of Palestinian militants responsible for the 1972 Munich massacre, had earlier applied similar techniques against former SS officers believed to be involved in the ongoing suppression of evidence about the Holocaust or in the provision of intelligence support to hostile Arab states. The exact scope of Israeli operations against former Himmler subordinates has never been fully disclosed, but it is known that several of the letter bomb attacks on figures like Alois Brunner in Syria were carried out by Israeli intelligence operatives. The extent to which Mossad operations against former SS men succeeded or failed is a subject of ongoing historical research, complicated by the continued classification of relevant intelligence records in multiple countries. The question of institutional responsibility for the crimes of the Himmler Empire has become increasingly prominent in recent decades. German corporations that used concentration camp slave labor have faced both legal action and moral pressure to acknowledge and compensate for their involvement. In 2000, after years of negotiations involving the German government, German corporations, and representatives of victim groups from multiple countries, the German Foundation Initiative Remembrance, Responsibility, and the Future was established with an initial endowment of 10 billion Deutschmarks, roughly 5 billion euros, provided equally by the German government and German industry. This fund made one-time payments to surviving forced labourers and other victims of the Nazi regime, with the German government insisting that the payments carry a moral rather than strictly legal character. By the time the foundation completed its initial payment programme in 2007, it had disbursed approximately 4.5 billion euros to approximately 1.67 million survivors in more than 90 countries. The companies that contributed included Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler-Benz, Deutsche Bank, Allianz, and Siemens, all of which had benefited in various ways from the forced labour system that Himmler's SS had operated. The payments were widely acknowledged as inadequate in strictly financial terms, but significant as a gesture of institutional acknowledgement. The role of the Catholic Church and other religious institutions during the period of Himmler's crimes has also been a subject of sustained historical and moral examination. Pope Pius XII's response to the Holocaust, his decision not to issue explicit public condemnations of the mass murder of Jews, despite being aware of it from at least 1942, has been one of the most controversial questions in post-war religious history. The debate about whether a more forceful papal intervention could have saved lives, or whether it would simply have resulted in the persecution of Catholics without affecting the killing, continues among historians and theologians. The role of individual Catholic clergy and institutions in facilitating the escape of former SS men through the rat lines, the escape routes that carried former Nazis to South America and other destinations, has been more clearly established by historical research and has been a source of considerable embarrassment for the Church. The Odessa organization, the organization of former SS members, which allegedly provided false documentation and escape routes for SS men using the cover of Catholic institutions, including Vatican City, remains partly documented and partly mythologized, but the involvement of individual church figures in facilitating the escape of at least some prominent war criminals is well established. Himmler's crimes also had profound and lasting effects on the development of international refugee law. The millions of displaced persons in Europe at the end of the war, including surviving concentration camp prisoners, forced labourers and refugees from the Eastern Territories, created an international humanitarian crisis that led directly to the establishment of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which established the modern international legal framework for the protection of refugees. The Convention's definition of a refugee, a person with a well-founded fear of persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, was written with the experience of the Jewish victims of Himmler's persecution specifically in mind. The right to asylum, now a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, grew directly from the recognition that Himmler's Europe had demonstrated what happened to people who had no such right. The international legal and institutional framework that the Nuremberg trials helped create represents one of the most important legacies of the effort to reckon with Himmler's crimes, even if the trials themselves were deeply incomplete in terms of those they prosecuted. The Nuremberg Principles, adopted by the United Nations in 1950, based on the legal foundations established at the trials, codified for the first time in international law the concept of individual criminal responsibility for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, establishing that following orders was not a valid defense against charges of international crimes. The Genocide Convention, adopted by the United Nations in December 1948 and entering into force in January 1951, created an international legal definition of genocide and committed signatory states to prevent and punish it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in December 1948, enshrined fundamental human rights in international law, partly as a direct response to what the Nazi regime had done. The International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute of 1998 and operational since 2002, provides a permanent international tribunal for the prosecution of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, the precise categories of crime that Himmler's empire had committed. All of these institutions, all of these legal frameworks were created in direct response to what Himmler and the regime he served had done to millions of human beings. His crimes, in a terrible irony, produced some of the most important advances in international humanitarian law in history. The concept of crimes against humanity, which is now central to international law and which applies to a wide range of situations in the contemporary world, was developed specifically to capture crimes of the type that Himmler's apparatus committed. Crimes carried out by a government against civilian populations. Crimes that transcend the boundaries of ordinary war crimes because they are not committed against enemy combatants in the context of war, but against defenseless civilians, often the state's own subjects for reasons of race, ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation. Every time the International Criminal Court indicts a head of state or a military commander for crimes against humanity in the 21st century, it applies legal principles that were forged in the effort to account for what Himmler did. The SS documentation that Himmler's organization produced and that survived the war, now preserved in archives across Europe and the United States, represents an extraordinary historical resource. The thoroughness with which the SS recorded its own crimes is itself a reflection of the bureaucratic culture Himmler instilled in his organization, the belief that what they were doing was historically significant, that it deserved to be documented for posterity, and that there was nothing to be ashamed of. The Nazis expected to win the war and intended their archives to be studied by admiring historians. Instead, they became the primary evidence base for the prosecution of the crimes they documented so meticulously. The records of the Einsatzgruppen, the transport records of the deportations, the statistical reports on the number of Jews killed in various regions, the correspondence about the construction of the gas chambers, the medical records of the experiments, all of this documentation exists because Himmler's organization believed in recording its work, and all of it has been used by historians, prosecutors, and educators to understand, prosecute, and teach about the crimes of the Nazi regime. The testimony of survivors has been another irreplaceable resource. The accounts given by survivors at the Nuremberg trials, at the Eichmann trial, at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, and at subsequent proceedings constitute a human record of the crimes of the Himmler Empire that transcends the documentary evidence in its emotional and moral force. Survivors like Elie Wiesel, who testified to the world in his memoir Night about the experience of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, or Primo Levi, whose account of Auschwitz, in If This Is a Man, remains one of the most profound documents of the Holocaust, or the testimony of the thousands of survivors who spoke at trials or were interviewed by researchers and documentary filmmakers, have ensured that the victims of Himmler's crimes are not remembered merely as statistics but as human beings with faces and names and histories. The Shoah Foundation, established by filmmaker Steven Spielberg following the making of Schindler's List, has recorded the testimonies of over 50,000 Holocaust survivors and witnesses, creating an archive of human memory that will outlast the last survivors and continue to bear witness long after the generation that experienced the crimes has passed. The relationship between memory, history, and identity in the countries most directly affected by Himmler's crimes has been complex and contested. In Israel, the Holocaust is central to national identity and to the Zionist narrative that the establishment of a Jewish state was the necessary and only adequate response to the centuries of persecution, culminating in the genocide. Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, is one of the most solemn dates in the Israeli calendar. The Yad Vashem Memorial and Research Institute in Jerusalem is the world's largest repository of Holocaust documentation and the most comprehensive educational institution dedicated to Holocaust history. The names of millions of victims are preserved in Yad Vashem's records. In Poland, which lost approximately 6 million citizens during the war, including 3 million Polish Jews who constituted the largest single national community murdered by Himmler's apparatus, the historical memory of the Holocaust is complicated by a number of factors. Polish national memory has traditionally emphasized Polish victimhood, which was real and enormous, at the expense of acknowledging the degree to which some Poles collaborated with the Nazi murder apparatus or failed to assist their Jewish neighbours. In recent years, this historical debate has become politically charged, with the Polish government passing legislation in 2018 that threatened to criminalise statements attributing responsibility for the Holocaust to the Polish state or nation, a law that was subsequently modified under international pressure, but which reflected the sensitivity of the subject in Polish political culture. The scholarly debate about Polish responses to the Holocaust continues, with historians like Jan Gross, whose 2001 book Neighbours documented the massacre of Jedwabne's Jewish population by their Polish neighbours, contributing essential but controversial research to the picture. In Germany, where the crimes originated and were ultimately directed from, the process of historical reckoning has been the most sustained and in many ways the most productive. The German educational curriculum treats the Holocaust as a central subject from primary school through to the Abitur. German students visit concentration camp memorials as part of their education. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in the heart of Berlin, a massive field of 2,711 concrete stelae designed by American architect Peter Eisenman, opened in 2005 and has become one of the most visited sites in Berlin, a city centre permanently marked by the memory of what was done by the government of the country whose capital it is. The memorial to the Sinti and Roma victims of National Socialism opened in 2012, and the memorial to homosexuals persecuted under National Socialism, opened in 2008, acknowledged the breadth of the crimes committed under Himmler's authority against groups beyond the Jewish victims. In the broader sweep of history, there is an argument to be made that Heinrich Himmler was the most destructive single bureaucrat who ever lived, not in the sense that he was more evil than Hitler, who bore ultimate responsibility for the Nazi state and its crimes, not in the sense that he possessed more military or political genius than the great conquerors of history, but in the specific technical sense that he was the individual most responsible for constructing and managing the apparatus that translated ideological evil into organized, industrial-scale mass murder. Without Himmler, Hitler's genocidal intentions might never have been realized at the scale they were. The Nazi regime contained many who shared Hitler's ideological goals, but it was Himmler who had the administrative talent, the organizational drive, the ideological fanaticism, and the personal authority to build the system that could kill millions. He is the man who turned the idea of genocide into a bureaucratic project, and he managed that project with horrifying competence. The concentration camp system he built from scratch in 1933 was still functioning, murdering people when he was arrested in May 1945. The SS he created from 300 men grew to nearly 1 million. The genocide he organized killed 6 million Jews and millions of others over a period of 4 years. He read the reports, signed the orders, visited the sites, and delivered speeches praising the work. He did all of this with the calm, methodical diligence of a civil servant who takes pride in his work. He did it while writing affectionate letters to his daughter. He did it while obsessing about his herb garden and his homeopathic remedies. He did it while dreaming of a restored Germanic civilization built on the ruins of the peoples he was murdering. He is, in the most complete and horrible sense, the embodiment of what organized evil looks like. Not a howling monster, but a determined, efficient, ideologically motivated bureaucrat who applied all of his considerable organizational talents to the task of mass murder and achieved results that will define evil for as long as human civilization endures. To understand Himmler is not to excuse him. It is to see with terrible clarity how much damage a man with the right ideology, the right circumstances, the right organizational capabilities, and the right ideological protection from above can do in the world. He is not a unique aberration. He is a warning. He is a demonstration of what becomes possible when institutions designed to serve the state are instead redirected toward the service of an ideology that places abstract racial categories above the concrete reality of human lives. He is what happens when a bureaucracy is instructed to commit genocide and staffed with people who believe in the genocide they are committing. He is what happens when the mechanisms of a modern state are put at the service of a totalitarian ideology without effective resistance. The victims of Heinrich Himmler were not abstractions. They were Rivka and Abraham from Warsaw. They were Yanis and Elena from Salonika. They were Lena and her children from Vilnius. They were the men of Babi Yar and the women of Ravensbrück and the children of Treblinka. They were the Soviet soldiers who died in open fields in Poland. They were the Polish intellectuals shot in the autumn of 1939. They were the Roma families murdered in August 1944. They were the disabled children killed in facilities that their parents had believed were hospitals. Each of them had a name, a history, a future that was taken from them by the organization that Himmler commanded. Their deaths demand not only to be remembered, but to be understood. understood as the deliberate acts of an organization built and managed by a specific human being who made specific choices, who had specific powers, and who used those powers to commit crimes of extraordinary magnitude and extraordinary deliberateness. The responsibility lies not in the abstraction of a regime or an ideology, but in the specific decisions and specific orders of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, the man with the round spectacles and the meticulously kept files and the affectionate letters to his daughter, the man who oversaw the murder of millions and called it a glorious page in history that would never be written. It was written, it is written, and it will not be forgotten. Well, that brings us to the end of this deeply important examination of the horrifying crimes of Heinrich Himmler. If this video gave you a fuller understanding of the man who built the machinery of the Holocaust and what his crimes actually entailed, then make sure to check out our other videos on the key figures of the Third Reich, including our explorations of what happened to Hermann Göring and what Adolf Eichmann actually did all day. The crimes of the Nazi regime cannot be understood through Hitler alone. They were the product of a system, and the men who built and ran that system deserve to be examined with the same seriousness and the same historical rigor. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our future World War II content. We appreciate every single one of you watching, and we will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.